Our next topic is a good one, and I know all of our presentations today are good, but this is one that I've really been looking forward to for a long time now. It's Velociraptor and Law Enforcement by Luke Fardell. So take it away. Oh, let me introduce Luke first. So Luke is the director of DFIR for control risks, specializing in ransomware investigations. He has investigated over 100 ransomware incidents globally and previously worked for the UK's National Cybersecurity Centre, as well as the Ministry of Defence. That sounds really important. So I'm going to hand it over to Luke.
Amazing. Thank you, Carlos and Mike, and everyone at Rapid7 for having me. Yeah, this is a slightly different topic. A lot of the topics have been really kind of technical, which is awesome. I wanted to give you a scenario we were faced with that you might end up being faced with yourself, and just to kind of give you points that I've learned along the way, and just something to bear in mind if you end up in these situations as well. And I'll give you a bit of a background on a specific case we had, obviously anonymized, and then I'll go into the detail about how Velociraptor helped us, what it collected, and how we dealt with law enforcement with data that we did have from Velociraptor. So I'll share my screen here for you. Let's see. Hopefully you can see that now. Great. So we had an incident. We do.
Still don't see your screen.
Oh, hold on. There you go. You have to hit the share button. That would help.
We see it. All right, go ahead.
So we deal with lots of ransomware cases every year. I said 100 there, but it's probably hundreds now. And you get that phone call on a Friday night from a company that have called you up. And for this specific case, we had all the same sort of indicators that we typically get for a ransomware case. IT admins couldn't access systems. Everybody's screaming at the help desk because they can't access their data. But there was some sort of different kind of symptoms on this one that were quite interesting. So physical access to the building was disabled, and also when the staff, the IT department, tried to get a hold of the network, they couldn't get access to any of their sysadmin accounts. So they had to physically go to the server room, and they found they couldn't get in there, and that system didn't rely on the domain credentials. So it was, for them, it was very strange. They hadn't experienced anything like this before. They had to jimmy the door open to actually get into the server room. So we did our typical thing. We started scoping the incident, and the kind of trigger for us is that basically the data was inaccessible. So we were expecting to jump on the file servers and find everything ransomware, etc. So we started talking through what they had actually done on the network to begin with, and they'd done a little bit of kind of triage analysis. They managed to get into the server room, jumped on a local admin account, started going through those event logs, and found that there was a strange domain admin account that was conducting a lot of the activity. So this was all new to them, and they raised these on the calls, and that's something we typically see anyway, but it was that physical access thing that kind of spiked our interest a bit on this one, which was super cool. So let's just click through these. So the client immediately contained the network as much as possible. They didn't want anything coming in and out of the network at all. We weren't sure what we were dealing with here. So the way they did it was we weren't allowed to deploy Velociraptor like we usually do, which is using Azure with the GitHub, MFA, etc. But we did find a solution on the call. It took a little while, but we managed to get a jump box in the network, and we deployed it on that, deployed the agents through Manage Engine, and we were linked into the endpoint within the network using Tailscale, which is fantastic if you've not used it. And they were happy with that communication in and out of the network. Everything else was blocked. We were able to run hunts, collect data on that host locally, and then the collected data that we got, we were able to pump out over the Tailscale link to our local systems to do the analysis and forensics that we wanted to do. So one of the big things I'll say, rightly or wrongly, one of the things we always do, and we've got really good at, and when we jump in a box with Velociraptor, is run a triage hunt. We usually do a basic collection on everything. It uses tons of data, and that's why Mike's previous talk about the scalability thing will massively help us in the future, because we want to get a snapshot from every system on that domain as quickly as possible. Just basics like MFT, registry, and event logs. I can do 90% of my investigation with that amount of data. And when we're working through the investigation, the client, this is Friday night, they want to be fully operational by Monday morning. So they were there ready to pull the plug on the domain controllers, start rebuilding the Active Directory. And then they've got offsite backups. They're going to, get those uploaded. So the network that we had access to was about to be nuked, and we had a very limited window to grab what we could. It felt like a bit of a robbery, but we had to go in, get what we could. So massive triage hunt, and then grab key logs and bits and bobs from the domain controllers, anything on the perimeter, firewall logs, etc. Get it and get out, basically, was our message. So we identified that this strange account was created many months prior to the attack, and this plot started to thicken, and so we started tearing into the data, and we issued all the kind of standard hunts we do, evidence for execution, lateral movement, key indicators, and stuff like that. We also run AD audit on the domain controller and identified the account that threat actor was using, and we started tracking that account and the activity that it had conducted during its access window that we had. And something else again that piqued interest was there was absolutely no reconnaissance within the network. It was at that point we realized we were dealing with someone who knew the network, an insider threat. I've done a lot of training in network compromises, and you always do prepare and learn about insider threats, but it's rare you actually see one. But when you see one, you'll know about it, because the way they move is just so smooth, and it immediately kind of, normally they drop in tools left, right, and center, scanning the network and the domain, but it was just like bang, bang, bang from system to system. The threat actor went on the access control systems, physical access control systems for the building, without having to find it, just hopped on it, went on the application and messed up everyone's access to the building, which was super interesting. I didn't actually know what the application was, but we found the activity through shellbag analysis, and we started calling it out over the calls to the victim. And they were like, that explains why we couldn't get in the building on this morning. And we didn't know about this at that stage. They hadn't put two and two together. They just turned up for work, couldn't get in, and kind of dismissed that. And then when they got in, the network was on fire. So when we started finding these, they were like, oh, okay, that doesn't make sense. But we started to kind of piece this puzzle together. We extracted the entity.dit and system hives, and dumped all those lovely hashes. And we got the hash for the account that threat actor created, and we were able to crack the hash over a period of time, which later on became relevant to the case. We grabbed the VPN logs, etc., as we always did, and we identified the system name that connected into the domain through the VPN logs, and this all kind of started ringing bells with the client. Essentially, we were faced with an insider threat. Former employee left the company, but before they left, created an account, and then some months later used that access to get back in and thought they'd make a mess of the network, essentially. So we didn't know at the time we were dealing with an insider threat, and evidently this case went through the kind of, fire weekend, I call it, where we had to grab as much data as we could, get the network back up and running, report our findings, etc. And then some months later, as this process kind of carried on, it became obvious that it was going to end up in court. And, the network as it was at the time is long gone. The data we collected is the data we have to do our investigation on. And evidently that's going to be the evidence that goes forward to court. So how did Velociraptor help us in this situation? So evidently massively. We had all the triage images from every host on the network. We also because we deployed that kind of jump box as well, we were able to just scoop all the logs, everything that Velociraptor dumped. We could just take the whole lot out. So we got all the metadata as well for all the triage images that's created with the Cape triage image collection. So that is, what files collected from which host, when, etc. So that in itself is a lovely kind of piece of evidence. All the results from all the hunts. So I've blurred them all out here, but your typical evidence for execution. We took the results from everything, downloaded it locally, and stored it. The client information from the server side. So we're able to, give a list of all the devices that we were deployed to, very nice and neatly. We actually contain as well the deployment configuration. So the MSIs we used to roll it out, all the server access logs. So that's the Linux box, the actual server side, to prove that that was intact and not interfered with at all. All the hunts we ever executed. So on the server side, you can dump all the hunts lists, and that shows you, when you run the hunts, which hosts as well ran the hunts, which is quite key. And we also grabbed lots of screenshots as we were going through. We wrote a lot of custom hunts, etc., on the fly, and we were able to just capture all those and screenshot everything. We do this anyway, and I was really grateful we did it because it came in extremely useful. So where are we right now? So speaking from a UK perspective, I'm sure it's probably similar across the globe. The procedures that we're working with right now with law enforcement are really not fit for the scale of investigations and the methods we're doing the investigations with right now. So, we're speaking to law enforcement and lawyers, and they're expecting you to turn up at a laptop and be able to full disk image the laptop, to multiple disks at the same time, chain of custody paperwork for each host that you go to, which is amazing when you've got 1 to 10 laptops, or you've got 1 to 10 staff with you doing this process. When the network's on fire and you're told you've got 4 or 5 hours to get as much data as you want, you've got to get out. And there's 2,000 hosts. That process is just impossible. So it's not scalable. The kind of cloud environments we're having to work in now, these auto scaling systems, etc., it's just not possible. There's also a very good argument about the over collection of data. You've got systems which are not directly linked to the investigation, and by full disk image in these systems, you're collecting other users' data, etc. So there's a PII argument there as well, over collecting data. As you all know, it's very time consuming doing the imaging process. The amount of data stored on our devices is increasing by the day. Obviously, network sizes are increasing in complexity and size. And then when you factor in stuff like RAID systems and then SSDs, you image an SSD, you can do it 10 minutes later and you won't get the same hash. So, you've got to explain this in court, which is pretty tricky. This was me just running a test actually on a 256 gig SSD, and the verification took longer than the actual imaging itself. So it's just trying to highlight the point really that scalability is just, that was a quick 256 SSD. We're dealing with terabytes these days. So this is just a quick run through of like the law enforcement structure and kind of how I dealt with this. So I was dealing with a metropolitan law enforcement, so they had a technical understanding to a certain degree, but it varies massively depending on who you're speaking to. So local law enforcement and some regionals might not do cyber investigations a lot. So you're going to have to really walk them through what it is. When I said I deployed Velociraptor, they said, "Where is it now? Can we have it?" And it was like, so kind of you really got to talk them through what it is you're doing, how you're collecting data, how it differs from what they're used to and what they're trained on. And then we sat down and talked about how we collected the data, and the police would talk about law enforcement, the lawyers not having a good understanding, and then the lawyers would talk about the police not having a good understanding, and it was trying to find that balance and get the language and the kind of message across that we collected it the way we collected it. We didn't realize it was going to end up in court, but we are confident the methods we did use are sound, and we can prove that. So how does Velociraptor track these, help tackle these issues? So when we did the CAPE collections, every single file is logged and hashed on upload, which when you're speaking to lawyers and the police, this started to resonate with them. They started to understand, oh, okay, right, so the data taken from there was hashed on upload, bang, so it's not been interfered with, and we can then go back and prove that single strip of data has not been impacted. And just talking them through this really helped. All the metadata for the files uploaded is stored in a separate CSV as well. So that's your typical MACB timestamp data. So that was really useful, because then we could go back to the original data and prove that it hadn't changed at all during this process. All the backend server data, so what we did, when we did it, how we did it, was invaluable during this process. So the list of hunts we did, the results, which clients ran which hunts, and data on all the users in the domain, etc., where they'd been. Like, we could track all this so neatly with Velociraptor, which was absolutely incredible. But we had to find a way to boil this down with the lawyers and containerize the data we had collected and put it all together in a nice kind of neat way, so that it could go to court and we could, replicate that investigation again and again and again, or anyone else could. So what we ended up doing is archiving it all into an LO1, like a custom content image with FTK. But speaking with the lawyers, we could have used any tool as long as we could we understood how the tool works, and we can verify the hashes, etc., of that contained evidence store. So I put some examples here: 7 ways, X ways, etc. You can do that with those as well. Everything we did, we kind of archived it, labeled it. It was all nicely neat per host, and then all the additional logs, we just kind of made a big, nice, neat stack essentially. All the configuration data for the deployment of Velociraptor, all our documentation about when we did it, how we did it, store all of that, times, dates, etc. Get it all stored, logged. If you keep a log, like we did when you're having calls with people and you're doing things and actioning things, store those in that evidence file as well. All the external data that we captured, and we essentially, got all this data together, archived it, hashed it, and handed it over. So the main lesson learned for me is, this goes back to the kind of principles of forensics, the data integrity and the documentation. So I put a quote down there at the bottom. We've got a kind of a legal framework here that the police use called ACPO in the UK, which basically there's kind of guidance about how to collect digital evidence in a sound manner. And the key phrase is that any third party can repeat the process and arrive at the same result. And the documentation is out of date, and I have reached out to them to try and help and input into that. But if that is the key phrase, essentially all my evidence that we gathered, I can hand that over to somebody else, and it's containerized, it's intact, every artifact in there is intact, and we can prove that they can reconstruct the whole investigation from beginning to end and come to the same conclusion. and all the kind of data around that Velociraptor collects is part of that overall massive package. Understanding Velociraptor and how it affects the system, the logs that are left on the system as well, is really crucial. And yeah, just making sure that that investigation is 100% repeatable for the courts, etc. So yeah, that was basically what I wanted to cover off. So yeah, massive project. Went in there, didn't realize that it was going to have a law enforcement angle at the end. Then all the original evidence is gone, but we preserved everything we collected. We can prove how we did it, and it's all gone through the courts, etc. And yeah, just wanted to highlight that Velociraptor does massively help how it collects the data. Are there any questions?
Yeah, this is great. Thanks a lot, Luke. That was absolutely fascinating. Yeah, does anyone have any questions for Luke? Pop them into the chat, pop them into the Q&A, the Discord channel. We do have one comment in there. Mayo notes that there would be no way of doing this without a tool like Velo. And then a counter comment by Mike, not in the time pressure, for sure.
Yeah, time pressure was massive. I've been in networks and people have had to, well, I've had to stop people from just yanking cables, and I'm waiting for, data to download. I'm like, please just give me 5 more minutes. And they're like, no, this has got to go. And they're starting pulling cables out. So having that way that we can jump in, hundreds, thousands of hosts and just grab a triage image from everything. And even if we just got that, we could walk away happy and just be like, boom, 90% of our investigation should be fine.
I just wanted to add, can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, when we're doing consulting, that what you were mentioning about essentially archiving the whole Velociraptor server, and that was like a pretty standard thing. And a lot of companies require that, especially after getting consultants in to do IR, because then they would have like an audit trail of saying, hey, the consultants came in, they did this, and essentially that archive of the whole Velociraptor data store with all the hunts and the logs and everything. And if they need to go back and say, what did these guys do on our network? They can say, hey, they collected all these stuff. This is all the evidence. This is what they touched. So it kind of like archives the job, in general, like just, it's not a law enforcement thing, but it's just an audit compliance type thing, right?
Yeah, exactly. All the data's there, and it's beautifully presented. You just need to get it and hang on to it.
Yeah, so it's good to archive it at the end of consulting jobs. That's what we used to do a lot. So just wanted to acknowledge that. That's good.
Yeah, Mike, there is a question in the Q&A, probably directed to you, Mike, not directly related to the talk, but about LE forensics and Velociraptor in general. Are there any plans for Velociraptor to create something like AFF images instead of pure zips to satisfy the quote unquote forensic soundness of its collections? Or is AFF4 dead anyway?
Well, I mean, so the thing about AFF is that AFF is a zip file anyway, right? The thing about what makes AFF not a zip file is having this RDF data model with provenance and hashing and all this sort of stuff. So we already do hashing, and and so there is kind of like a standards, an AFF standard, but look, I mean, we could generate it if there's demand for it, and if there is client libraries to be able to do it, but I don't actually think it's necessarily. Like as Luke was showing, as long as you have the hashes, it doesn't matter what format you actually store the hashes in. I mean, at the end of the day, you're going to create an AFF format file, which is just a zip file with an RDF, style, file in it that has hashes. So, instead we're creating a zip file with CSV file that has hashes. So, it doesn't really matter. It's the same thing. We still have the same data in it, right? So
yeah. And you've got the FTK hunt as well. You can do the logical image to a local drive remotely as well, if that's a necessity.
Yeah. Yeah, you can image the disk, right? Oh, the logical image, right? So you did the logical image of the data store. Is that what you're saying?
No, I didn't. But that's another option. Like if people want to kind of preserve the data, I
Yeah,
guess you
but I mean,
could.
at the end, it doesn't really buy you that much. It's just another archive format. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, yeah, we could discuss it, maybe raise an issue, and we'll discuss with the merits of it. But I don't really see the difference between a zip file with hashes and an FF4 file with hashes. It's the same thing.
Okay, another question from Sam Spade, who asks, what does it take to collect forensics-ready data with regard to insider threat?
It's all your typical. What does it take? As in, I mean, like the triage images. The way I like to do it is grab the data. Well, in this instance, grab the data using Velociraptor, and then take it out and do your investigation with whichever. Well, you can do it on the host as well, but you run it in X-rays or whatever tools you like to use, Event Log Explorer, etc. And in this instance, we could only really use Velociraptor to grab quickly at scale. The bulk of our investigation was done outside of it. But yeah, I think when you work, I've worked on hundreds of ransomwares, and there's that period of kind of the threat actor fumbling around the network for a while. The shell bags are wild. You see them clicking through stuff. They're dropping like advanced IP scanner, etc. And they don't know where they are, what's going on. We've seen threat actors, looking up the company name on the company's network, like who the hell are these guys, basically, and looking up their net worth as well before they deploy the ransomware. So when you jump into an insider threat case, it was just totally different. As I mentioned, the threat actor was just moving, boom, boom, boom. Like there was no kind of where am I? It was like I'm going here, I'm doing this, bang, bang, and the actual kind of dwell time was minuscule. They knew exactly what they were doing. So yeah, you'll know it when you see it. Trust me.
Right. Nissi asks, is there somewhere I would be able to find details on any legal cases involving Velociraptor?
I don't know is the honest answer. I don't know of any, unless you might, Mike or Carlos, but I don't know of any that have gone all the way through and ended up in prosecution yet. I might be the first.
I guess you might be. First time for everything, right?
Do I get a badge?
Yeah. All right. Well, unless there are, let me check. It might be one more question. There's one more. Apologies if this was already asked. My connection dropped. Luke, did you do any research to characterize Velociraptor in terms of impact of the live client on the target systems? For example, what changes to the original system occurred specifically due to the Velociraptor client with principle 2 of ACPO in mind?
So we deployed it on our own host as the server in the environment. Well, the host they provided for us, but because we used that hot box, it was all kind of nicely contained on that host. And in terms of the endpoints, we use Velociraptor for most of our investigations. It's extremely lightweight. All the kind of data is preserved in whatever location you choose, essentially during your configuration. So in your YAML configuration, you can specify where the kind of data is written, etc., before it gets uploaded to you. So yeah, I mean, we're very familiar with the tool, and no issues, describing the impacts of it on the remote systems. It's extremely minimal. I think, Mike, you'd probably know more, but yeah, very minimal. And now you can throttle it as well, so yeah.
All right, sounds good. I think that's it in terms of questions. Luke, thanks again. This was great.
Thanks for having me, and I really appreciate it. Thanks.
We all learned a lot.